The last sound was the shriek of tearing metal. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't reckless. I was just 19, sitting in the passenger seat as a torrential rain hammered the roads of Maple Creek, Ohio. 2 days later, I surfaced from the darkness, not with my own breath, but with the cold, rhythmic push of a ventilator. My chest felt like it had been crushed, and a plastic tube snaked deep in my throat, sealing off any sound I might have made. But the horror of that near-death experience was nothing compared to the truth I was about to hear. A truth whispered just outside my door, a truth that hurt more than any broken bone. I heard one nurse say the hospital had called my family immediately, told them I might not make it through the night. Then the other nurse said the words that would redefine my life. They said they couldn't come. The other daughter, Serafina, had a spa appointment for her Afghan hound. They say everything has a price. That night, I learned mine. It was less than a pet grooming session. My name is Elise Bell, and this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how they priced me, and how I proved them dead wrong. They were betting I'd remain the invisible shadow in their picture-perfect family portrait. Or at least, that's what they thought. What my parents never counted on was the plan they discussed over the phone while they thought I was unconscious. And their reaction, years later, when they came face to face with the soldier their cruelty had created, is something I will never forget. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. I lay there, a prisoner in my own body, listening to every word slice through the sterile air of the hospital room. The physical pain, the feeling of shattered ribs and bruised lungs began to fade into the background. It was replaced by an icy chill that started in my chest and spread through every vein, a coldness no hospital blanket could warm. A dog spa. The two words echoed in the silent chamber of my mind. Not a critical business meeting, not another family emergency. A grooming appointment for a pet. I desperately searched for some other explanation, some catastrophic misunderstanding. But there was none. The truth was simple, brutal, and bare. On their list of priorities, my life didn't even make the top 5. The feeling that washed over me wasn't sadness. It was a hollow void. It was as if someone had taken a cosmic vacuum and sucked every feeling out of me, leaving only a cold, silent space where a daughter's heart used to be. My mind, disconnected from my broken body, began to spiral back through a lifetime of evidence. Suddenly, this moment wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern. I was 12, and I'd just flown over the handlebars of my Schwinn bike, landing hard on the pavement. I remember cradling my arm, a sickening, unnatural angle below the elbow, and running home, crying. My mother, Genevieve, took one look at my swollen, purpling arm and sighed. "Oh, Elise, you're always so dramatic," she'd said, grabbing her car keys. "I have to get Serafina to her ballet class now." That evening, my father, Sterling, came home from work, saw my arm, and finally drove me to the ER. The doctor asked why they had waited so long. The fracture was obvious. My father, with a practiced, charming smile, just lied. "She's a stoic kid, didn't tell us how bad it was." And I, as always, stayed silent. I covered for them. I protected their image, their narrative, their perfect family. Floating there in my hospital bed, I realized this time was no different. This wasn't a single shocking act of negligence. It was simply the final, damning chapter in a long, long book about my own invisibility. This wasn't a mistake, it was policy. And Duchess, the dog, she wasn't just a pet, she was a prop. A beautiful, elegant accessory for the perfect Bell family portrait my mother had spent her life curating. Duchess was a prize-winning Afghan hound, and her entire existence was a performance. I remembered my mother at a neighborhood barbecue just a few months prior, bragging to the other wives. "Duchess will be at Westminster this year," she'd announced, beaming. "A prize-winning dog is a sign of a family with pedigree, you know." Now I understood. Their presence at my bedside would have been an inconvenience, a crack in that flawless facade. It would mean worried faces, canceled social events, and uncomfortable questions. But Duchess succeeding at the most prestigious dog show in America? That was a story they could tell at dinner parties for months. In that moment, on that hospital bed, I wasn't their daughter fighting for her life. I was a PR inconvenience for their brand. Sometime later, the door creaked open again. An older nurse came in. Her name tag read, Alina. She had kind, tired eyes. She didn't say much as she checked the monitors that beeped a steady rhythm beside me, a rhythm that was keeping me alive. She adjusted my blanket, her movements gentle and deliberate. And then, she reached down and took my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip firm and sure. She looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time, I felt seen. In her gaze, there was an understanding I had never, not once, received from my own mother. "I'm here with you," she whispered, her voice a low comfort. "You're not alone." Her words couldn't fix my broken bones or the gaping wound in my soul. But they did something just as important. They validated my pain. They confirmed that what I was feeling was real, that this betrayal was as monstrous as it felt. The simple, unearned kindness of a total stranger through the unimaginable cruelty of my own family into stark, unforgiving relief. And in that cold, quiet room, a new feeling began to stir beneath the emptiness. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, something colder. It was the first spark of a resolve that would one day burn their perfect world to the ground. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling tiles, I began to understand that my life wasn't a story. It was a museum. And my mind, now detached from the pain, was the unwilling curator, forcing me on a tour through its silent, echoing halls. Each exhibit was a perfectly preserved injustice, polished by years of silent resentment. The dog spa incident wasn't the centerpiece of the collection. It was just the newest, most grotesque acquisition. The smell of roast turkey and pumpkin pie, for most people, means family and warmth. For me, it's the scent of suffocation. My mind drifted to last Thanksgiving, just a few months ago. The scene was perfect, like a magazine cover. The warm glow of the chandelier, the clinking of silverware on my mother's best china, the low murmur of happy conversation. I remember feeling a knot of nervous hope in my stomach. For the first time, I had news that felt substantial, something that might finally earn a nod of genuine approval. My father, Sterling, stood up, tapping his champagne flute with a spoon. The room quieted. He looked regal, proud, his gaze sweeping over the family he had built. It swept right past me. "A toast," he said, his voice booming with a practiced paternal warmth. "To our brilliant daughter, Serafina. She's been accepted to NYU." The room erupted in applause and cheers. My aunts and uncles beamed. I forced a smile, the muscles in my face feeling stiff and unnatural, and clapped along. My own victory, my own news, felt like ash in my mouth. My acceptance letter, the one offering a full 4-year scholarship to Ohio State University, was sitting on the kitchen counter, buried under a pile of Pottery Barn catalogs and junk mail. I'd tried to tell them earlier that afternoon, my hands trembling as I held the thick envelope. I had found my mother in the dining room, fussing over the floral centerpiece. "Mom," I'd started, my voice barely a whisper. I got in. A full ride. She didn't even turn around. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she'd said, her attention fixed on an errant rose petal. "We can talk about your state school later. Right now, could you go slice some more pie? Your aunts are waiting." So I stood there, watching Serafina soak in the adoration, holding the heavy serving knife, the handle cold and solid in my hand. In that moment, surrounded by family, I had never felt more like a ghost. I was a functional part of the scene, but not a celebrated part of the story. I was the help. The exhibits in my private museum went back years, each one a testament to the family's unspoken policy. There was the Hall of Unequal Investments. Serafina had a perfect, dazzling smile, a work of art that had cost my parents thousands of dollars in braces, retainers, and whitening treatments. It was an investment in her beauty, a down payment on a successful future. I had a small jagged chip on my front tooth from that bike accident when I was 12. I remember asking my mother, just once, if we could look into getting it bonded. We were in the kitchen. She was on the phone, scheduling one of Serafina's hair appointments. She covered the receiver and gave me an irritated look. "Oh, Elise, don't be so vain," she'd whispered. "It gives you character." When Serafina brought home a C in algebra, a crisis was declared. It ended with the purchase of a brand new iPhone, a tool, my father explained, to help her get organized. When I brought home my report card with the highest grade in the entire junior class for AP Physics, an achievement that took countless nights studying at the library, my father glanced at it over the top of his Wall Street Journal. He folded the paper, took a sip of his coffee, and simply nodded. "That's your job, Elise," he'd said, his tone final. "Nobody gives a fish a prize for swimming." With every comparison, every casual dismissal, they carved their message deeper into my soul. Serafina's existence was an asset to be polished, invested in, and displayed. My existence was an obligation to be fulfilled, an expense to be managed. I wasn't their daughter, I was a line item on their balance sheet. And I clearly wasn't providing a very good return on their investment. But the most twisted, most soul-crushing exhibit in the entire museum was the one I called the cruelty of hope. Because the worst part, the part that kept me chained to them for so long, was that sometimes they were kind. After a week of giving me the silent treatment for some unknown infraction, my mother might suddenly come home from the mall with a new sweater for me, always a neutral color, always a size too big. "I saw this and thought of you," she would say, her voice suddenly soft and maternal. Those small, unpredictable gestures were like crumbs of bread thrown to a starving person. They were just enough to keep a desperate hope alive, just enough to make me silence the screaming voice in my head and think, maybe this time it will be different. Maybe this time they see me. But the warmth was always temporary, a brief thaw before the inevitable, biting freeze returned. Lying there, with the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator as my only companion, I finally saw it for what it was. It wasn't love, it was maintenance, it was manipulation. It was how they kept their tool from rusting. Staring at that blank ceiling, the memories stopped being individual slights. They clicked together, locking into place like the links of a heavy chain that had bound me my entire life. They had taught me that my value was conditional, measured only by my usefulness to Serafina and the perfect family image. And now, lying here broken, helpless, and of no use to anyone, my value had finally, officially, hit zero. A cold, clear question formed in my mind. It wasn't, why? I was done asking why. The new question was sharper, harder, more dangerous. How much longer will I allow this to continue? And in the silence of that hospital room, a seed of rebellion planted years ago by a random afternoon episode of Oprah I'd barely paid attention to, finally began to sprout. I remembered her looking directly into the camera. "You teach people how to treat you," she had said. For 19 years, I had taught my family that my silence could be bought for the price of a cheap sweater, that my worth was negotiable. It was time for a new lesson. If you think it's time for me to start fighting back, press 1 in the comments to show your support. I really could have used it back then. A few days later, Serafina finally made her appearance. She didn't arrive with red-rimmed, worried eyes, but with an air of profound annoyance, as if visiting me was an errand she'd been forced to run between brunch and a shopping trip. She swept into the sterile room wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my first car. A cloud of expensive, cloying perfume followed her, a scent so strong it felt like an invasion in the quiet, antiseptic space. She placed a cheap-looking gift basket on the bedside table. It was the kind you find at a CVS, filled with stale crackers, hard candies, and a lotion that smelled like chemicals. "Mom and Dad sent me to see how you are," she announced, avoiding my eyes and instead inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. "Everyone at home is just so stressed out by all this." There it was. Not a single question about my pain, my recovery, or the fact that I had almost died. Just a complaint about their inconvenience. I stared at her, at the perfect symmetry of her face, the effortless grace she carried, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear disgust. And then, she delivered the final blow, the one that would sever the last frayed thread of connection between us. She looked at me, her expression a practiced mask of sisterly concern, and said, "I know you didn't mean to cause all this trouble for everyone." The words hung in the air between us, as if the accident was my fault, as if my entire existence was a burden she and my parents were forced to endure. In that precise moment, any lingering trace of doubt, any whisper of a hope that I might have misunderstood, evaporated. The chill in my veins turned to ice. It was over. I was done. After she left, leaving the scent of her perfume and the cheap basket behind, I used the call button to page Alina. My voice was raspy from the ventilator tube they'd recently removed, but it was steady. "Could you bring me a pen and some paper?" I asked. "I need to write something down." She returned a few minutes later with a notepad and a simple ballpoint pen. My hand still trembled from the trauma and the medication, but the words that flowed onto the page were anything but weak. They were lucid, cold, and final. This wasn't a letter. It was an indictment. I methodically listed the evidence, each count a separate paragraph. Count 1. The broken arm, left untreated for hours in favor of a ballet class. Count 2. The chipped tooth, dismissed as character while thousands were spent on a perfect smile. Count 3. The Thanksgiving dinner, where a full scholarship was deemed less important than slicing a pie. And the final damning count, Duchess the dog, whose spa appointment was more urgent than my own life. I didn't plead. I didn't blame. I didn't fill the pages with my tears or my anger. I simply stated the facts, laying them out like a prosecutor presenting an open and shut case. Then, I wrote the final sentence, the one that would change everything. I remembered a line from my high school American history class, a line that had seemed so abstract then, but now felt profoundly personal. It was about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For the first time, I applied those words to myself. I wrote, "Effective today, you have abdicated your rights and responsibilities as parents, and I, Elise Bell, hereby declare my independence from your rule." Signing my name at the bottom felt like signing the Declaration of Independence for my own life. A profound sense of release washed over me, a quiet and solemn liberation. I folded the letter neatly. But I didn't ask Alina for an envelope. I wasn't going to send it. Staring at the crisp folded pages, I had a moment of pure clarity. I didn't need them to read it. I didn't need their reaction, their denial, or their false, theatrical apologies. The act of writing it all down, of giving voice to a lifetime of silent screams, was for me. It was my own validation. It was me, finally, believing my own story. I slipped the letter under the thin hospital mattress. When I left, it would stay behind, a relic of the person I used to be. That girl, the one who waited for permission to exist, had died in this room. Not from a car crash, but from the truth. The day of my discharge, I was changing out of the hospital gown and into the same clothes I'd been wearing during the accident, still smelling faintly of rain and fear. Alina came in, her shift just ending. She approached me quietly and pressed a small, plain white envelope into my hand. "It's not much," she said softly, her kind eyes meeting mine. "I just wanted you to have a start." I opened it. Inside were 5 $20 bills, $100. And for the first time since I woke up in this hospital, I began to cry. The tears weren't for my family, or for my pain, or for my own loneliness. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. A stranger, a woman who owed me nothing, had given me more than my family ever had. She gave me the acknowledgement that I was worth helping, that I mattered. That small wad of cash wasn't just paper. It was a testament. It was a passport. It was my ticket to a new life, a life that would be entirely my own. And as I walked out of those hospital doors, into the bright, uncertain sunlight, I clutched it in my hand like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Because it was. Stepping out of the hospital, the world felt too big, too loud. Maple Creek, a town I had known my whole life, suddenly felt like a foreign country. With Alina's $100 tucked into the pocket of my jeans, I was officially on my own. Freedom, I discovered, had the sharp, metallic taste of fear. The money didn't go far. $80 went to the first week's rent for a grimy, shoebox-sized room above a smoky dive bar on the edge of town. The lingering smell of stale beer and old cigarettes seeped into everything I owned, a constant reminder of my new station in life. My first meals were a rotation of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on the cheapest white bread I could find. When I felt like splurging, I'd treat myself to a can of Campbell's tomato soup, eaten cold, straight from the can, because I couldn't afford a hot plate. About a week in, a letter arrived, forwarded from the hospital. The return address was my old home. The elegant looping handwriting was Serafina's. I didn't open it. I walked the half-mile to the old bridge overlooking the creek, the one where kids dared each other to jump in the summer. I stood there for a long time, the envelope feeling heavy in my hand. It was an anchor to a life I was desperately trying to leave behind. I let it go. I watched the white rectangle float on the brown, murky water, carried downstream until it was just a speck, and then it was gone. It was a funeral for my past, and with that I knew I had to find work. Fast. I walked up and down Main Street, going into every shop with a help wanted sign. But nobody wanted to hire a 19-year-old girl with no experience, no references, and a haunted look in her eyes. The rejections piled up, each one chipping away at my fragile resolve. Finally, out of desperation, I pushed open the door to a place I'd passed 100 times but never entered, Miller's Hardware. The bell above the door chimed, and a wave of smells hit me. A unique, earthy perfume of motor oil, sawdust, and metal dust. It smelled like work, like honesty. Behind the counter stood an older man, George Miller. He was tall and wiry, with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His hands were calloused and stained, and his eyes, a piercing blue, seemed to see right through me. He was a Vietnam vet, a Marine, something the whole town knew and respected. He didn't ask where I was from or why I needed a job. He didn't ask for a resume. He just looked me up and down, then jerked his head toward the back of the store. "There's a push broom back there," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Sweep the stockroom. If you do a good job, come back tomorrow." I grabbed that broom and I swept that dusty concrete floor as if my life depended on it. Because, in a very real way, it did. I swept until my back ached and my hands were raw. I organized loose nuts and bolts into their proper bins and stacked paint cans into neat, perfect rows. When I was done, the room was immaculate. I didn't know if he would even check, but it didn't matter. It was the first thing in a long time that was truly mine, my own effort, my own work. I came back the next day. And the day after that. For a month, I worked in near silence. He'd point to a task, and I'd do it. I learned how to mix paint to the perfect shade, how to cut keys, how to distinguish a lag bolt from a carriage bolt. I was a sponge. At night, in my little room, I read the store's product catalogs, memorizing part numbers and specifications. I was determined to be useful, to be indispensable. One afternoon, a notoriously difficult customer, Mr. Henderson, came in, complaining about a leaky valve on a pipe that was probably installed before he was born. The part was long discontinued. As Mr. Miller was patiently explaining this, a flicker of memory sparked in my mind. I had seen something similar, tucked away on a high shelf in the back, covered in dust. "Excuse me, Mr. Miller," I said quietly. "I think I might know where one is." Both men looked at me. I scurried to the back, climbed a ladder, and found it. An old, heavy brass valve, a perfect match. I wiped it clean with a rag and brought it out. Mr. Henderson was stunned into silence. He paid and left without another word of complaint. After the bell on the door chimed behind him, Mr. Miller walked over to me. He was silent for a moment, just looking at the spot where the valve used to be. Then he nodded, a short, sharp movement. "Good work, Belle," he said. "You've got a good memory." That was it. No fanfare, no gushing praise, just a simple statement of fact from a man who valued competence above all else. But those 7 words felt heavier and more valuable than a bar of gold. It was the first time my worth had been measured by what I could do, not by how I compared to my sister. Slowly, things began to change. George, he eventually told me to call him George, started treating me less like an employee and more like family. After we closed up shop, he started inviting me to dinner at the Maple Diner. We'd sit in one of the worn, red leather booths, and over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he'd tell me stories. He talked about his late wife, Martha, and about his time in the Marine Corps. He never once asked about my parents or where I was living. He didn't have to. I had the feeling he already knew everything he needed to. One evening, as we were sipping coffee, he looked at me across the table. "The Corps teaches you something, Belle," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It teaches you that family isn't about who you share blood with. It's about who you'd fight for." That sentence landed in my soul and planted a seed. It was a path I had never considered, a future I couldn't have imagined. For the first time since I'd stood on that bridge, I didn't just feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was starting to build something. For a few months, my life settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. I had my job at Miller's Hardware, I had my evenings at the Maple Diner with George, and I had a fragile, hard-won peace. It was a small life, but it was mine. I was beginning to believe I'd finally outrun the shadows of my past. But peace, I was learning, is a luxury that is easily broken. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in October. I had just finished my shift and was walking back to my apartment, the satisfying ache of a long workday in my muscles. I was halfway down Main Street when a familiar, gleaming black SUV pulled up to the curb beside me with a sudden, aggressive halt. The passenger door swung open, and my mother, Genevieve, stepped out. She was dressed in an expensive cream-colored dress and oversized designer sunglasses, looking less like she was looking for her estranged daughter and more like she was on her way to a luncheon at the country club. Her eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, scanned my work clothes, jeans stained with paint thinner and a flannel shirt covered in a fine layer of sawdust, with an undisguised look of disdain. I froze on the sidewalk. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a cold dread washing over me. This wasn't a reunion. This was an ambush. And she had chosen her battlefield carefully. Main Street, in broad daylight, where the eyes of Maple Creek were always watching. "Elise," she began, her voice a syrupy, sweet performance of motherly concern. "Darling, I've been so worried about you." Her words were a lie, and we both knew it. She didn't ask where I was living, if I was eating, or how the scars from the accident had healed. She didn't ask a single question about me. Instead, she launched into a monologue about the town gossip, about how my situation was causing a stir and embarrassing the family. She spoke of appearances, of reputation, of the Bell family name. It was always about the name. Then she deployed her main weapon. She took a step closer, her voice dropping into a more intimate, manipulative tone. "Your grandmother hasn't been well, Elise. Her health is failing. She's been asking for you." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You need to come home. You need to fulfill your duty as a granddaughter." It was a perfect trap, and my stomach churned. She was using my grandmother, the one person in that family who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine affection, as bait to lure me back into the cage. My mother didn't care about my grandmother's wishes. She cared about restoring the illusion of the happy, perfect family. My return would silence the gossip. It would fix the crack in their public image. But the girl who would have crumbled under that guilt trip was gone. She had died in that hospital. I stood my ground, my posture rigid. "How is she?" I asked, my voice flat and cold. "If Grandma needs me, tell her to call me herself." My response clearly stunned her. She wasn't used to resistance. She was used to my immediate, tearful compliance. The mask of sweet concern shattered, and for a second, it fell away completely, revealing the raw, ugly contempt she truly felt for me. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss, low enough so that Mrs. Gable from the bakery across the street couldn't hear. "Who do you think you are?" she spat, her words like acid. "You're nothing. A glorified clerk in a filthy hardware store. You will never be anything without the Bell name behind you. You owe us. You owe us everything. You owe us." That single phrase erased every last doubt, every microscopic flicker of hope that they might one day change. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a possession, an investment that had gone bad, an asset that was no longer performing as expected. I just stared at her, my face a blank canvas. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a single tear or a single angry word. Then I turned my back on her and started walking away. I could feel her glare burning into my back, a palpable heat of pure fury. But I didn't look back. I didn't go to my apartment. My hands were shaking too badly to fit the key in the lock. I walked, almost on autopilot, to the one place that felt like a sanctuary, the Maple Diner. I slid onto a stool at the counter, the worn vinyl cool against my legs. "Just a black coffee, please, Sal," I mumbled to the owner. My hands trembled so much that I sloshed the hot liquid over the side of the cup when it arrived. As I was fumbling for a napkin, my eyes landed on a poster taped to the wall behind the counter. It was a U.S. Army recruitment poster. A group of soldiers, their faces resolute and united, stood under a bold, simple slogan, "Army Strong." I stared at that poster, the words burning into my brain. I thought of George, of his quiet strength and his unshakable sense of fairness. I thought of his words. Family isn't about who you share blood with. It's about who you'd fight for. I thought about a place where your worth was measured by your actions, not your last name. A place built on discipline and respect, earned, not given. I thought about a place so far away from Maple Creek, Ohio, that the long, dark shadow of the Bell family could never, ever touch me again. In that moment, staring at that poster with the smell of coffee and grease in the air, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to leave. Not just my apartment, but this town, this life. I had to go. That feeling when you finally realize that the only way to win is to walk away from the game entirely. It's terrifying, but it's also liberating. If you are rooting for me to take this leap and find my strength, hit that like button and type, "Go for it," in the comments below. 2 days after the confrontation with my mother, the final straw fell. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it broke what was left of my back. My father, Sterling, walked into Miller's Hardware. It was a slow afternoon, and George was in the back, running inventory. It was just the two of us. He didn't greet me, he didn't ask how I was. He strode to the counter with the air of a man executing a business transaction and placed a sheaf of papers in front of me. They were legal documents, thick and official. He pushed them toward me with one perfectly manicured finger. "Sign this," he commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It's a quit-claim deed. You're signing over your inheritance rights to your grandmother's plot of land. Serafina and her fiancé need it." I stared at him, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. My grandmother's land. It was a small 2-acre plot on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy. But it was the one place on earth I had ever felt truly happy. It was where she had taught me how to plant sunflowers and identify birds by their songs. It was the only tangible piece of her love that I had left. "Why would I do that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me then, and his expression was one of genuine bafflement, as if I had just asked him to explain the color blue. "Because you'll just let it go to waste, Elise," he said, his tone laced with a weary condescension. "They want to build a house there. Be useful to the family for once in your life." Useful? The word hung in the air, thick and heavy with the weight of 19 years. That's all I was to them. All I had ever been. A tool. A means to an end. Something to be utilized. I looked from the papers to his impassive face, and a strange calm settled over me. All the pain, all the anger, all the desperate yearning for their approval simply dissolved. There was nothing left to fight for. The war was over, and I had lost long before I was even born. I reached for the pen that lay on the counter. My hand was perfectly steady. I uncapped it and signed my name on the line he had indicated. The signature was clear, firm, and decisive. I pushed the papers back across the counter. "It's done," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "Now you can go." The sheer lack of emotion on my face seemed to startle him. He had expected tears, or arguments, or a pathetic plea. He hadn't expected this finality. He snatched the papers from the counter and left without another word, scurrying away as if he was afraid I might change my mind. But he didn't understand. That signature wasn't an act of surrender. It was a declaration of war on my old life. I had just signed the death certificate of our relationship. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up in my small, lonely room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the darkness. I watched a documentary I'd found online about General Anne Dunwoody, the first woman in U.S. military history to achieve the rank of a 4-star general. I watched her speak, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable authority. "Your value is not in your gender," she said, "but in your leadership and your contribution." Her words gave me a target. They gave me a destination. The next morning, I took a bus to the next town over, to the U.S. Army recruitment office. The recruiter was a tired-looking sergeant first class with deep lines around his eyes, but he answered every one of my questions with a patient, straightforward honesty. He talked about discipline, about camaraderie, about the chance to see the world. He didn't promise an easy life. In fact, he promised the opposite. He promised a hard life, a life full of challenges that would push me to my absolute limit. And that was exactly what I needed. A challenge I could conquer with my own 2 hands, on my own terms. A place where my worth would be proven, not debated. The hardest part was saying goodbye to George. I told him that evening, after we'd locked up the store for the last time. He stood there for a long moment, leaning against the counter, just looking at me. He wasn't surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting it all along. Finally, he pushed himself off the counter and put a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. "They're gonna try to break you in there, Belle," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're gonna try to grind you down to nothing. Don't you let 'em. You show them what you're made of." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old, worn wristwatch, the one he'd worn every day since I'd met him. It was a simple, military-style watch with a faded canvas strap. He pressed it into my hand. "So you never lose track of time," he said gruffly. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. The day I left, he drove me to the Greyhound station in his old pickup truck. We didn't say much on the way. We didn't need to. He walked me to the bus, and as I was about to step on, he just gave me another one of his short, sharp nods. It meant everything. As I climbed the steps onto the bus, I made a conscious decision. I didn't look back. I didn't give Maple Creek, or the Bell family, or the ghost of the girl I used to be one last glance. I found a seat by the window and looked straight ahead, down the long open road toward a future I was going to build for myself, one piece at a time. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the dead of summer, is the closest thing to hell on earth. The air is thick, hot, and so humid you feel like you're breathing water. And the mosquitoes are the size of small birds. The bus ride had been a blur of anxiety and second thoughts. But the moment the doors hissed open and that wall of heat hit me, I knew there was no going back. Within the first few hours, our drill sergeant stripped us of everything that had made us individuals. They took our civilian clothes, our hairstyles. I watched my long hair fall to the floor in clumps. And most importantly, our first names. I was no longer Elise, I was Trainee Belle. Or more often than not, Maggot Belle. The drill sergeant, a man whose neck was thicker than my thigh, got an inch from my face, his voice a roaring hurricane of spit and fury. "Do you understand me, maggot?" he screamed. But then he moved to the person next to me and screamed the exact same thing, and the person after that. For the first time in my life, the playing field was level. The mud didn't care whose father was a banker. The obstacle wall didn't give a damn if your sister was the prom queen. The brutal, relentless harshness of basic combat training was, in a strange and twisted way, the kindest, most merciful thing I'd ever experienced. It was fair. The days were a physical inferno of push-ups, ruck marches, and crawling through dirt until my knuckles and knees were raw. But the nights were a different kind of hell. Lying on my squeaking metal bunk bed in the suffocating darkness of the barracks, the ghosts of Maple Creek would come to visit. My mother's condescending tone, my father's dismissive glare, Serafina's casual cruelty. They would replay in my head on a relentless loop. There were nights, soaked in sweat and aching in every muscle, that I wanted to quit. Nights I wanted to just curl up and cry until I had nothing left. But then, in the darkness, I would remember the serenity prayer my grandmother had taught me, her voice a soft hum in my memory. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I couldn't change my past. I couldn't change them. Their voices in my head were a part of me. But I could change how I got my ass over that climbing wall tomorrow morning. I could change how I held my rifle, how I squeezed the trigger to steady my aim. I had the courage to change the things I can. So, I learned to turn the pain into fuel. Every push-up became an act of defiance, my arms straining as I imagined pushing their faces, their expectations, their disappointment further and further away from me. Respect in basic training is its own language. It isn't given, and it isn't requested. It's earned, inch by painful inch. There was a guy in my platoon, Riker, a big-as-a-house farm kid from Texas who, for the first few weeks, made it clear he thought I was a fragile little doll who would wash out. He'd mock me under his breath when I struggled to lift my pack, or roll his eyes when I was the last one to finish a run. But he also saw me fall face first into the mud and get back up without a word of complaint. He saw me spend my free time cleaning my rifle until it gleamed, long after everyone else was done. He saw me refuse to quit. Ever. One day on the firing range, something clicked. The world narrowed down to the front sight of my M4, the target, and my own steady breathing. I squeezed the trigger, again and again, hitting every single target dead center. My drill sergeant walked over, looked at my paper target, then at me. He just gave a single, sharp nod. Not bad, Belle. Do it again. No flowery compliments, no patronizing praise, just a simple acknowledgement of competence. It was worth more than gold. That night, in the controlled chaos of the mess hall, Riker slid his tray onto the table next to mine. He shoveled a mountain of mashed potatoes into his mouth, then looked over at me. "You can shoot," he grunted. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. And in that moment, in the universal, unspoken language of respect, we became part of the same tribe. The final test of basic combat training is a brutal 96-hour crucible called the Forge. It's designed to break you. We marched dozens of miles with heavy rucks, slept for maybe an hour or two a night, and ran simulated combat missions until our bodies screamed for mercy. On the final day, during the last 10-mile march, my legs felt like lead and my lungs were on fire. Every part of me wanted to just sit down on the side of the road and give up. But then I looked ahead and saw Riker, the biggest, strongest guy in our platoon, stumbling. His face was pale and he was weaving from sheer exhaustion. Without a second thought, I moved up beside him. I didn't say a word. I just reached over and unclipped his heavy ammunition pack, hooking it onto my own already overloaded ruck. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. In that look, I was no longer Maggot Belle or the fragile doll. I was just Belle, his teammate. He put a hand on my shoulder, and I helped steady him. We limped the final 2 miles together, 2 soldiers side by side. At our graduation ceremony, standing in my crisp dress uniform, I felt taller than I ever had in my life. When they called out the names and I heard, "Private First Class Belle," I stood ramrod straight. The name Belle was no longer the brand of an unloving family. It was no longer the weight of their disappointment. It was the name on my uniform, a uniform I had earned. It was a suit of armor I had forged for myself, in the fires of Fort Jackson. The Korengal Valley in Afghanistan looked nothing like the pictures. It was a place of brutal contrasts. The sun beat down with a physical weight, baking the rocky terrain until the heat shimmered off the ground, while the nights were cold enough to make your bones ache. The fine tan dust was a living entity. It coated our skin, settled in our lungs, and ground between our teeth. And the silence, the deep, watchful silence of the mountains, was more terrifying than any sound. But it was here, in this hostile alien landscape, that I finally found what I had been searching for my entire life. I found my family. It wasn't a family of blood, but of bond. Our family was our platoon. We were brothers and sisters forged in shared hardship. We'd sit in the dust, sharing bland, vacuum-sealed MREs, passing around worn, creased photographs of wives and kids back home. We stood guard while the others slept, trusting our lives to the person next to us. Riker, the Texas farm boy who once saw me as a liability, became the brother I never had. Our bond was simple, stripped of all the complex, toxic layers I'd known before. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would die for me, and he knew I would do the same for him. There were no conditions, no balance sheets. We were on a routine patrol, moving in a staggered line down a dusty, sun-bleached wadi when the world simply exploded. An IED, buried in the road, detonated directly under the lead Humvee. The sound was a deafening, gut-punching roar that ripped through the valley. Before the dust from the initial blast even settled, the crackle of automatic gunfire erupted from the ridges above us. Ambush. Everything became a chaotic blur of instinct and training. Shouts, muzzle flashes, the smell of cordite and burning diesel. We hit the dirt, seeking cover behind any rock we could find. Through the thick, swirling smoke, I saw the Humvee. It was a twisted wreck, engulfed in flames. And I saw Riker. He was trapped in the passenger seat, his leg pinned by a piece of crumpled metal, the fire licking at the door beside him. Everyone was pinned down, returning fire, following protocol. But my world narrowed to a single point. Riker's face, contorted in pain and fear. My mind went blank. There was no thought, no debate, no weighing of the odds. All those months of training, all those years of suppressed anger and grief, all the resilience I had clawed for, it all coalesced into a single, pure instinct. I got up and I ran. I ran toward the burning vehicle, the heat so intense it felt like it was melting my skin. Bullets whizzed past me, kicking up little puffs of dust at my feet. I reached the mangled door, the fire roaring in my ears, and I grabbed the front of Riker's body armor. I pulled. He screamed as his leg was wrenched, but I didn't stop. I planted my boots in the dirt and pulled with every ounce of strength I had, every injustice I'd ever suffered fueling my muscles. He came free, just as the ammunition inside the Humvee began to cook off. I dragged him behind the engine block seconds before the vehicle was ripped apart by a second, massive explosion. The medal ceremony was a formal, sterile affair back at the forward operating base. A 2-star general pinned the Bronze Star to my chest, his voice droning on about extraordinary heroism and gallantry in action. The medal felt cold and strangely light on my uniform. It meant nothing. The real meaning, the true reward, came a few days later in the dim light of the field hospital. I went to see Riker. He was lying in a cot, his leg encased in a massive cast and suspended in the air. He saw me and his tired face broke into a weak grin. He reached out and grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked me straight in the eye, and his voice was raw with emotion. "You didn't leave me, Belle," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you. Thank you for not leaving me behind." Those 2 sentences. They healed something inside me that was far deeper and more broken than any wound a bullet could have left. They had left me behind. My own family had left me to die for something as trivial as a dog's haircut. But I, when faced with a true life-or-death moment, had not left him. In that dusty antiseptic tent, I finally broke the curse. That night, back in my small room, I couldn't sleep. The Bronze Star lay on the small table beside my cot, gleaming in the faint light. But it wasn't the medal I was thinking about. It was Riker's words, echoing in my head. "You didn't leave me." I had proven my worth on the battlefield. I had proven it to my platoon, to the army, and most importantly, to myself. But there was one last battle to fight, the one I had been running from my whole life. I opened my standard issue laptop, the fan whirring to life in the quiet room. I opened a new document and just started typing. I told the whole story. The car crash, the hospital, the whispers, the dog spa. I wrote it all with a calm, clinical precision. There was no embellishment, no exaggeration. Just the cold, hard, unbelievable truth. For the title, I wrote the simplest, most honest sentence I could think of. My life was valued less than a pedigree dog. I read it over one last time, my finger hovering over the mouse. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. It was about taking back the narrative that they had controlled for so long. It was about freedom. They say the truth will set you free, but I was learning you have to be the one brave enough to speak it first. If you believe I did the right thing by finally telling my story, hit that like button and type, "Speak your truth," in the comments to show your support. I took a deep breath, and I clicked post. For the first time, my story was out in the world, sent like a flare into the dark, and I had a feeling the whole world was about to hear it. My blog post didn't just make a splash, it created an earthquake. The story, "My life was valued less than a pedigree dog," went viral in a way I could never have anticipated. It was shared tens of thousands of times, first through military networks and veterans forums. Then it was picked up by national news outlets and morning talk shows. The narrative was just too compelling. The small-town girl, left for dead by her social climbing family, who becomes a decorated war hero. It was a quintessentially American story of resilience. Back in Maple Creek, the earthquake hit hardest. The Bell family, once the town's paragon of class and success, became social pariahs overnight. I heard through the grapevine, a call from an old high school acquaintance, that my father's high-end furniture store was suddenly empty of customers. My mother was asked to take a break from her prestigious book club. And Serafina, after a firestorm of vicious comments, was forced to delete all of her social media accounts. The one thing they valued above all else, their perfect, polished public image, was shattered beyond repair. For the first time in their lives, they had lost control of the narrative, because it was no longer their story to tell. It was mine. A few months later, an official-looking envelope arrived at my Army base. It was an invitation to be a keynote speaker at the Veterans of Foreign Wars National Conference in Washington, D.C. The theme was the strength of resilience. I was terrified, but I knew I had to do it. This was the final battlefield. I stood backstage, my heart pounding against my ribs, the hum of the expectant crowd a low thrum through the floor. I was in my Army service uniform, the crisp green fabric feeling like a second skin. The bronze star on my chest felt heavy, a solid anchor of my new reality. When they called my name, I walked out onto the stage, into the blinding white spotlights. As my eyes adjusted to the glare, I scanned the vast auditorium, and then I saw them. Third row, center. My father, my mother, and Serafina. They looked smaller, older. The confident, imperial aura they had always carried was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted look. A part of me felt a flicker of shock, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold, hard certainty. They weren't here for forgiveness. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here for a photo op. They were hoping for a public spectacle of a tearful family reunion, a chance to spin the story, to be seen embracing their hero daughter, and, in doing so, redeem themselves in the eyes of the world. They thought they could just walk onto my stage and steal the spotlight. They were wrong. I walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the sea of faces, my gaze sweeping right past the third row as if it were filled with strangers. I took a deep, steadying breath. I didn't start with the car crash. I didn't mention the hospital. I never once uttered the word dog. My story, I had decided, would no longer be defined by what they did to me. It would be defined by the people who had built me back up. I told them about Alina, the nurse whose simple act of holding my hand in the dark reminded me that human decency existed. I told them about George Miller, the old Marine who gave a ghost of a girl a job and taught her that respect is earned with sweat, not inherited by name. I told them about Riker, the Texas farm boy who became my brother in the dust of Afghanistan. A bond forged not in a comfortable living room, but in the crucible of shared fear and absolute trust. They have a saying, I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the silent hall. Blood is thicker than water. But I've learned a different truth. I've learned that true family is not defined by bloodlines, it's defined by loyalty. Family is about who runs toward you when the rest of the world is running away. Family is about who shows up in the clutch. Family is the hand that pulls you from a burning vehicle, the quiet nod of respect from a mentor, the gentle word from a stranger when you have nothing left. With every word, I could feel myself laying the bricks of my new life, a foundation built on my own terms. And with every brick I laid, I could feel the demolition hammer swinging, smashing the false, hollow facade of their world. They had come to reclaim their story, but they didn't realize that I was no longer a character in it. I was the author of a new one. I brought my speech to a close, my eyes focused on the back wall of the auditorium, on the future. And so I want to say this to anyone out there who feels invisible, I said, my voice rising with a strength I never knew I possessed. To anyone who has been told they are not enough, your worth is not a gift that others can grant or take away. It is something you forge for yourself. You forge it with your sweat, with your tears, and with the courage to never, ever give up on yourself. The entire room rose to its feet. The applause was a thunderous, overwhelming wave of sound and support that washed over me. It wasn't pity, it was respect. As the applause finally began to fade, my eyes drifted back to the third row. It was empty. They were gone. They had slipped out sometime during the standing ovation, unable to face the truth, unable to exist in a story where they were not the heroes. Their silent, cowardly retreat from the stage I had built for myself, from the truth I had finally claimed as my own, was the sweetest surrender I could have ever imagined. My life now is at Fort Carson, Colorado. It's a world away from the flat, humid landscape of Ohio. Here, the air is crisp and clean, and the Rocky Mountains dominate the western horizon, a constant silent reminder of true strength and permanence. Their jagged peaks, often capped with snow even in the summer, make the dramas of my old life seem impossibly small. I'm a sergeant now. I lead a squad of new recruits, their faces a mixture of fear and determination that I know all too well. My life has found a new rhythm, one that I set for myself. It's simple. I wake before dawn, the air cold and sharp in my lungs. I run, I train, I teach. On the weekends, I hike. Sometimes Riker comes with me. He got stationed here after he recovered, a request he put in himself. We'll hike for hours up into the mountains, the only sounds the crunch of our boots on the trail and the wind whistling through the pines. We don't talk much about the past. We don't have to. The quiet, easy peace between us says everything that needs to be said. We are survivors. We are family. A few weeks ago, during an obstacle course drill, I saw something that felt like looking in a mirror. A young private, Davis, was struggling with the high wall. She was small, like I had been, and her arms trembled with exhaustion as she tried and failed to pull herself up. The rest of her squad had already cleared it and moved on, leaving her alone at the bottom, her face a mask of panic and shame. I saw the exact moment she was about to give up. The drill sergeant I used to be would have screamed at her. But I wasn't that person anymore. I walked over, my boots quiet in the dirt. I didn't yell. I just reached up a hand. "It's okay, Davis," I said, my voice calm and low. "I've been where you are, right here. Now take a deep breath. I'm going to show you where to place your feet. We're going to get over this together." She looked at my outstretched hand, her eyes wide with surprise. Then, she took it. In that moment, as her small hand grasped mine, I felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle had just been closed. I had become the person I so desperately needed when I was 19 and alone. I had turned my own scars into a map for someone else. About 6 months ago, I received a thick envelope from a law firm in Ohio. My grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep. My first reaction was a wave of grief, but it was followed by something else. Inside was a copy of her will. She had secretly set up a trust years ago, and in a final, quiet act of defiance against her own son, she had left her 2-acre plot of land to me. Tucked in with the legal documents was a small, handwritten note, her script, shaky but clear. "Plant your own flowers, my girl," it read. I didn't go back for the funeral. Instead, I sold the land. I knew I could never find peace there. I took every penny from the sale and established a small scholarship fund. I named it the Alina Grant, after the nurse who gave me $100 and a reason to believe in kindness again. It provides a yearly grant to a young person from a difficult background who wants to go to nursing school. I wrote one last letter to my parents. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was a simple, one-page document informing them of the scholarship that now existed in their town, a legacy of compassion born from their cruelty. It was my final act of turning a heritage of neglect into a heritage of hope. I never got a response, and that was perfectly, completely okay. I didn't need one. This morning, I woke up early, long before the bugle call. I got in my old pickup truck and drove out of town, away from the base. I parked on a ridge overlooking the vast plains that stretch out from the base of the mountains. I climbed onto the hood of the truck with a steaming mug of black coffee, the ceramic warm in my hands. And I watched the sun rise. It started as a faint, purple-gray line on the horizon, slowly bleeding into orange and pink, a fire spreading across the edges of the world. The first rays of light spilled over the peaks of the Rockies, chasing the shadows from the valleys below. The light was warm on my face, and I realized sitting there that I hadn't thought about them. Not once. My father, my mother, Serafina. They were just characters in a book I had finished reading a long time ago. They were living out their quiet, hollow lives in Maple Creek, a town whose streets I could no longer clearly picture. They were trapped in the silence of their choices. But me? I was here. I had the right to live a loud, vibrant life forged from my own choices, under this vast, endless Colorado sky. And that, in the end, was the only justice that ever mattered. That was freedom. That was peace. And that's where my story ends, but where my life truly began. For so long, my voice was silenced. But by sharing this journey with you, I feel like I've finally taken it back for good. Your support in the comments along the way meant more to me than you'll ever know. I believe everyone deserves to find their own sunrise, their own peace. If this story resonated with you, there are many others here waiting to be heard. Please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It truly helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them most. Thank you for listening.